You will address the king with respect, or you will not address him at all." The words cut through the kitchen like a blade, and Alara flinched, her hands stilling over the silver platter she had been polishing for the past hour. The head servant, Margot, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her expression carved from disapproval and barely concealed disgust. "And you will certainly not be anywhere near the ceremonial hall tonight. Your presence would be an insult to the occasion." Alara nodded, keeping her eyes downcast as she had learned to do over the years. Speaking only invited more cruelty, more reasons for them to remind her of what she was. Nothing. No one. An omega without a wolf, without family, without value. She had been found as an infant on the borders of the Blood Moon territory, wrapped in rags so threadbare they disintegrated when touched, with no identification, no pack scent, nothing to indicate where she had come from or who had abandoned her. The Alpha at the E. Time had allowed her to live, a decision many in the pack still questioned, and she had grown up in the shadows of the palace, doing the work no one else wanted to do, eating the scraps no one else would touch, and occupying a space so small and insignificant that most pack members did not even know her name. Tonight was the Ceremonia da Lua de Sangue, an event that occurred once every 50 years when the moon turned the color of fresh blood and the veil between the spirit world and the living. Realm grew thin. It was during this ceremony that the Alpha King would present his chosen mate to the ancestors, to the pack, and to the assembled leaders of every major territory on the continent. For months, the palace had been preparing. Alara had scrubbed floors until her knees bled, polished silver until her reflection mocked her from every gleaming surface, and prepared feast dishes she would never be allowed to taste. She had done it all in silence, as she always did, because silence was survival. The pack had no use for her voice. They barely acknowledged her existence. She was furniture, decoration. Less than either, actually, because at least furniture served a purpose people noticed. "The Lady Seraphina will be arriving within the hour," Margot continued, her tone sharp with anticipation. "She will need attendants to help her prepare. You will stay in the lower kitchens. You will not be seen. Am I understood?" Alara nodded again, and Margot swept from the room with the kind of self-importance that came from serving those who mattered. The moment she was alone, Alara released a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the polishing cloth. Lady Seraphina, daughter of Alpha Councilman Varenus. Beautiful, educated, powerful in her own right with a wolf as white as winter snow and twice as cold. She was everything an Alpha King's mate should be. Everything Alara would never be. The palace thrummed with energy as evening approached. Alara could feel it even in the depths of the lower kitchens where she had been confined. The actual ceremony would take place in the Grand Hall, a massive chamber carved from black stone and decorated with the sigils of every pack that had sworn fealty to the Blood Moon throne. Alara had only seen it once, years ago, when she had been tasked with delivering fresh linens and had made the mistake of glancing inside. The sight had stolen her breath. Massive columns rose toward a ceiling, painted with the history of their kind, depicting the first wolves, the first transformation, the first Alpha King crowned under a blood moon. Ancient magic saturated every stone, every carving, every inch of that sacred space. She would never set foot in it again. People like her did not belong in places like that. But fate, as Alara would soon learn, cared very little about what people like her deserved or where they belonged. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of screaming. Not the excited chatter of pack members gathering for the ceremony, but genuine screams of terror that echoed through the stone corridors and made every wolf in the palace freeze. Alara looked up from the potatoes she had been peeling, her heart suddenly racing. The screaming was followed by a sound she had only heard once before, during a raid on the northern border when she was a child. A roar, deep, primal, ancient. the kind of sound that vibrated in your chest and made your bones feel like water. The kind of sound that came from something far larger and far more dangerous than any normal wolf. Fenrir, the Alpha King's war beast. Alara dropped the knife she had been holding, and it clattered against the stone floor. Everyone in the realm knew about Fenrir. The creature was legend-made flesh, a beast from the old times when magic ran thick in the blood of their kind, and monsters walked alongside men. Bonded to the Blood Moon royal line for over 1,000 years, passed down. From king to king, Fenrir was said to be unkillable, unstoppable, and utterly loyal to one thing alone: the true ruler of the Blood Moon Pack. Not the person who wore the crown, but the person who deserved it. The person the old magic recognized. Alara had never seen Fenrir. Few had. The creature was kept in the ancient forest that bordered the palace grounds, emerging only when the king required its presence for war or for ceremonies of the highest importance. And apparently, tonight qualified. Another roar shook the palace, and this time Alara heard the unmistakable sound of stone cracking. She should stay where she was. Margot had been clear. But something pulled at her, something she could not name. Something that felt like invisible threads wrapped around her ribs and tugging her toward the upper levels. Before she could think better of it, before logic could override instinct, Alara found herself moving. She slipped from the kitchens and into the corridor, following the sounds of chaos. The palace was in disarray. Servants ran in every direction, pack members shouted contradicting orders, and the scent of fear saturated the air so thickly Alara could taste it on her tongue. She pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible as people rushed past without seeing her. Invisible, as always. She climbed the servant stairs, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might crack her ribs, and emerged on the 3rd level where the grand hall was located. The massive doors stood open, and through them Alara could see pack members crowding the entrance, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock. She should not look. She should turn around and return to the kitchens before anyone noticed her absence. But that pull, that inexplicable magnetism, dragged her forward. Alara edged closer, slipping between bodies that did not register her presence, until she could see into the grand hall itself. What she saw made her breath catch and her knees weaken. The hall was filled with hundreds of pack members, all dressed in their finest ceremonial attire, all frozen in absolute stillness. At the far end, on the raised dais where the Alpha King's throne sat carved from a single piece of obsidian, stood King Killian Stormborn himself. Alara had seen him before, of course, though always from a distance, always from the shadows where she belonged. He was exactly what an Alpha King should be. Tall, powerfully built, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders, and eyes the color of molten gold. He wore black ceremonial armor etched with silver runes that gleamed in the torchlight, and his presence alone commanded attention, respect, submission. Beside him stood Lady Seraphina, draped in white silk that contrasted beautifully with her pale skin and platinum hair. She looked like a goddess. She looked like a queen. But neither of them was what had captured the attention of every person in that room. Between the throne and the assembled crowd stood Fenrir. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. The creature was massive, easily twice the size of the largest wolf Alara had ever seen, with fur as black as a starless night, and eyes that glowed with an eerie blue light. Its shoulders were broader than a man was tall. Its claws carved grooves into the stone floor with each step, and its presence radiated power so intense that even from her position at the back of the hall, Alara felt her knees threaten to buckle. This was not a wolf. This was something older. Something that existed before wolves learned to walk as men. Something that remembered when magic was law and power was everything. The war beast stood in the center of the hall, its massive head turning slowly as if searching for something. Searching for someone. King Killian spoke, his voice carrying easily across the silent space. Fenrir recognizes the blood of the ancients. He calls, "To the one who carries the mark of the first line." His golden eyes scanned the crowd, confusion flickering across his features, for just a moment before his expression hardened into the mask of authority he always wore. "Step forward. Whoever you are, step forward now." No one moved. The crowd remained frozen, barely breathing, as Fenrir's glowing gaze continued its sweep of the room. Alara felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt sweat beating on her skin despite the cool air, felt that inexplicable pull growing stronger, more insistent, more impossible to ignore. This was madness. This had nothing to do with her. She was nobody. She was nothing. She did not even have a wolf. But her feet moved anyway. One step, then another, carrying her forward even as her mind screamed at her to stop, to hide, to run. The crowd parted without conscious thought, people shifting aside as if compelled by instinct they did not understand, creating a path from the entrance directly to the center of the hall, directly to Fenrir. Alara walked as if in a dream, her vision tunneling until all she could see was those glowing blue eyes fixed on her with an intensity that should have terrified her, but instead felt strangely familiar, strangely right. She was aware of the whispers starting, the gasps of shock, the hissed questions. "Who is that? Is that the kitchen girl? What is she doing here? Someone stop her before she gets herself killed." But no one stopped her. No one moved. They all simply watched as the girl they had ignored for 20 years walked toward a creature that could tear her apart with a single swipe of its massive paw. When Alara was perhaps 10 feet away, Fenrir moved. The beast took 3 ground-shaking steps forward, closing the distance between them in seconds, and Alara's breath caught in her throat. This close, she could see every detail. The scars that crisscrossed Fenrir's muzzle, evidence of countless battles survived, the intelligence in those glowing eyes, ancient and knowing and far too aware. The way the air around the creature seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. Alara knew she should run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but she could not move, could not breathe, could only stand there as Fenrir lowered its massive head, bringing those glowing eyes level with hers. For a moment, nothing happened. The entire hall held its breath. And then Fenrir did something that had not occurred in living memory, something that had not happened since the very first Alpha King had proven his right to rule over 1,000 years ago. The war beast bent its front legs and lowered its body until its massive head rested on the stone floor, at Alara's feet, in a position of complete and utter submission. The silence that followed was deafening. Alara stared down at the creature that had just knelt before her, her mind refusing to process what was happening. This was impossible. This was insane. She was nobody. She was nothing. She was just the kitchen girl who scrubbed floors and kept her head down and survived by being invisible. But Fenrir did not seem to care about any of that. The beast remained motionless in its submissive position, waiting. Alara's hands trembled as she slowly, hesitantly reached down. Her fingers made contact with Fenrir's fur, and the moment they did, the world exploded. Power slammed into her like a physical force, driving her to her knees beside the war beast. Images flooded her. Mind, memories that were not hers, knowledge that had been sleeping in her blood for 20 years, suddenly awakening with violent force. She saw battles fought before recorded history. She saw wolves the size of mountains running beneath skies painted with colors that no longer existed. She saw a lineage stretching back through time, an unbroken chain of power and magic and blood that connected her to something ancient, something primordial, something that had been lost so long ago that most believed it had never existed at all. The primordials, the first wolves, the original rulers who had commanded not through strength alone, but through their connection to the very essence of what it meant to be wolf, to be wild, to be free. Their line had been thought extinct, wiped out in the wars that had reshaped the world and established the Alpha Kings as the supreme authority. But it had not been extinct. It had been hidden, protected, waiting for the right moment to resurface, waiting for the right person to carry it forward. Alara gasped as the visions released her, leaving her kneeling beside Fenrir with tears streaming down her face and power crackling along her skin like lightning. She looked up, her vision swimming, and found King Killian standing directly in front of her. He had moved from the dais without her noticing, had crossed the hall in seconds, and now he stared down at her with an expression she could not read. "Impossible," someone whispered from the crowd, and Alara recognized Lady Seraphina's voice, sharp with disbelief and something darker, something that sounded like fury. "She is nobody. She does not even have a wolf. This must be some kind of trick." But Killian did not look away from Alara. His golden eyes searched her face as if seeing her for the first time, as if the girl who had been invisible to him for her entire life had suddenly become the only thing in the room worth looking at. "Fenrir does not make mistakes," he said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the silent hall. "The war beast knows the old blood when he encounters it. He recognizes the mark of the first line." He extended his hand toward her, and Alara stared at it as if it were a serpent about to strike. "Rise," he commanded, though his tone was gentler than she had ever heard from him before. "Tell me your name." "Alara." The word came out as barely more than a whisper, and she had to force herself to speak again, louder this time. "My name is Alara." She did not take his hand. Could not. The power still crackling through her veins made her afraid to touch anyone, afraid of what might happen if she did. Killian seemed to understand. He lowered his hand, but did not step back. Instead, he turned to address the assembled crowd, and when he spoke, his voice held the absolute authority of a king who would not be questioned. "The ceremony will proceed, but not as planned. Fenrir has chosen. The old magic has spoken. This woman carries the blood of the primordials, and by the laws that govern our kind, laws older than the crown I wear, she is recognized as true royalty." The hall erupted in chaos. Voices shouted over each other, some in protest, some in shock, some in excitement at witnessing something that would be spoken of for generations. Through it all, Lady Seraphina remained silent, but Alara could feel the weight of her stare, could feel the hatred radiating from the woman who had expected to become queen and had just watched that future crumble. Alara wanted to run, wanted to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged, where she understood the rules, where she knew how to survive. But Fenrir remained beside her, the massive beast now standing and pressing against her side, as if to anchor her in place. And she realized with dawning horror that running was no longer an option. Whatever had awakened inside her, whatever blood flowed through her veins, it had just changed everything. King Killian raised his hand, and the hall fell silent once more. The power of an Alpha King's command was absolute when he chose to use it, and every wolf in the room felt the compulsion to obey settle over them like a physical weight. "There will be time for questions later," Killian said, his golden eyes sweeping across the crowd with a warning that was impossible to miss. "For now, we will honor the Blood Moon's choice. Alara of the primordial line, you will stand with me for the remainder of this ceremony. Fenrir has named. You and I will not dishonor the old magic by refusing his judgment." He turned back to Alara, and this time did not offer his hand. Instead, he simply waited, giving her the choice to follow or flee. Alara looked at Fenrir, at the ancient creature who had recognized something in her that she had not known existed, and then at the crowd of pack members who stared at her with expressions ranging from awe to outrage. Her entire life she had been invisible, insignificant, ignored. Now every eye in. The room was on her, and she had no idea how to bear the weight of that attention. But she was tired. So unbearably tired of being nothing, of accepting scraps, of believing she deserved the cruelty they gave her simply because she had been born without the one thing that defined their world. A wolf. Except she did have a wolf. She could feel it now. That presence inside her that had been sleeping for 20 years, stirring at last, stretching as if waking from a long dream. It was not like the wolves she had seen others shift into. This was older, wilder, something that carried the echo of when their kind had been gods instead of subjects. And it was hers. Ilara took a breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked forward to stand beside the Alpha King. The crowd gasped. Fenrir followed, positioning himself on her other side. And together the three of them stood before the assembled packs, as witnesses to something that should not have been possible. What do you think will happen? Next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. The ceremony continued, though nothing proceeded as it had been planned. The High Elder, an ancient wolf whose fur had gone pure white with age, and whose eyes had witnessed the crowning of 3 Alpha Kings, stepped forward to perform the blood rites. Tradition dictated that the Alpha King's chosen mate would offer her blood to the ancestors, proving her worthiness to stand beside him and produce heirs that would carry the royal line forward. But as the elder prepared the ceremonial blade, his hands trembling slightly with age, or perhaps with the magnitude of what was occurring, Killian spoke. "The rites must be altered," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Ilara carries primordial blood. The ancestors will not require proof of her worthiness. They will require acknowledgement of her supremacy." The words sent another wave of shock through the crowd, and this time even the High Elder looked uncertain. "My king," the old wolf said carefully, "the ceremony has been performed the same way for centuries. To alter it now, especially given the circumstances, might be seen as—" He trailed off, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to finish the sentence. "Might be seen as what?" Lady Seraphina's voice cut across the hall, like a blade dipped in honey. She had moved from her position beside the throne, and now stood at the edge of the dais, her white dress flowing around her like water. Her expression perfectly composed except for the fury burning in her ice-blue eyes. Might be seen as the king being manipulated by a convenient trick? We all know the stories of the primordial line, Your Majesty. We also know those bloodlines died out centuries ago. What we are witnessing here is either an impossibility or a very clever deception. Ilara felt every word like a physical blow. Part of her agreed with Seraphina. This had to be a mistake, some cosmic joke being played at her expense. But the power thrumming through her veins, the way Fenrir pressed protectively against her side, the memories still echoing in her mind of battles and magic, and a time when her ancestors had shaped the world itself, all of it insisted this was real. Killian turned to face Seraphina, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop. When he spoke, his voice carried the kind of quiet danger that made seasoned warriors take a step back. "Are you questioning Fenrir's judgment, Lady Seraphina? Because if so, I would be more than happy to arrange a demonstration of just how infallible the war beast's instincts truly are." The threat was unmistakable, and Seraphina's perfect composure cracked just slightly, a flicker of fear crossing her features before she smoothed it away. "Of course not, Your Majesty. I merely suggest that we proceed with caution. Surely you can understand the pack's confusion. This girl has lived among us for 20 years, and not once has she shown any sign of carrying ancient blood. Not once has she even manifested a wolf. It is unusual, to say the least." She was right, of course. Ilara could feel the doubt rippling through the assembled crowd, could see it in the faces of pack members who had ignored her for 2 decades, and now were being asked to accept that she was somehow royalty. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, the High Elder cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the matter at hand. "Perhaps," he said slowly, we might allow the blood itself to provide answers. The ceremonial blade has been blessed by every Alpha King since the founding of the Blood Moon Pack. If Alara truly carries primordial blood, it will react to the old magic in ways that normal wolf blood cannot. Killian looked at Alara, a question in his golden eyes, and she realized he was giving her the choice. She could refuse, could walk away from this madness and return to the kitchens, to her simple life, to the safety of being invisible, or she could step forward and prove once and for all whether the impossible was actually truth. Alara thought about the 20 years she had spent scrubbing floors and eating scraps and being treated as less than nothing. She thought about every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every moment she had been made to feel worthless. And she thought about the power now flowing through her veins, the wolf stirring inside her consciousness, the ancient magic that recognized her even if the pack did not. "Do it," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Test the blood." The High Elder nodded and approached with the ceremonial blade. It was beautiful in a deadly way, forged from silver that had been mined from the sacred mountains and etched with runes so old their original meaning had been lost to time. The blade hummed with latent magic, and Alara could feel it calling to something deep inside her, something that remembered when weapons like this had been commonplace, when magic had been as natural as breathing. The elder took her hand gently, his ancient fingers surprisingly steady as he turned her palm upward. "This will hurt," he warned, though kindness softened his tone. "The old magic is not gentle when it wakes." Alara nodded, bracing herself, and the elder drew the blade across her palm in one swift motion. Pain flared bright and sharp, and Alara hissed through her teeth but did not pull away. Blood welled from the cut, crimson and ordinary, and for a heartbeat nothing happened. Alara felt her stomach drop. This had all been a mistake, a cruel joke. The universe's way of reminding her that she would never be anything more than what she was. But then her blood touched the runes etched into the blade, and everything changed. The silver began to glow, first faintly, then with increasing brilliance until it was nearly impossible to look at directly. The runes ignited with golden light, ancient words blazing to life after centuries of dormancy, and the air around them began to shimmer and crack with energy. Alara gasped as power surged up her arm from the point where her blood met the blade, racing through her veins like liquid fire. It did not hurt exactly, but it was overwhelming, consuming, transformative. She could feel something inside her responding to the magic, could feel barriers she had not known existed beginning to crumble and fall away. And then she felt her wolf, not the whisper of presence she had sensed before, but the full, overwhelming reality of it. The creature that had been sleeping inside her for 20 years suddenly opened its eyes, and Alara nearly collapsed under the weight of its consciousness joining with hers. It was massive, ancient, powerful beyond anything she had imagined possible. Its fur was the color of moonlight on water, silver and white and pale blue all woven together, and its eyes glowed with the same ethereal light that now poured from the ceremonial blade. This was not a normal wolf. This was something that had not walked the earth in over 1,000 years. This was a primordial. The light from the blade intensified until it filled the entire hall, forcing pack members to shield their eyes, and when it finally faded, Alara stood transformed. Her plain servant's dress had been replaced by ceremonial armor that had materialized from the magic itself, silver and white metal etched with the same ancient runes that decorated the blade, fitting her perfectly as if it had been made specifically for her body. Her brown hair, which had always been limp and unremarkable, now fell in waves that seemed to catch and hold light, and her eyes, when she finally opened them, glowed with the same pale blue luminescence as her wolf's. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Lady Seraphina, who had been so quick to voice her doubts, stood frozen with her mouth slightly open, unable to form words in the face of what she had just witnessed. The High Elder stared at Alara with tears streaming down his weathered face, and when he spoke, his voice shook with emotion. "Blessed by the moon," he whispered. "After 1,000 years, the primordial line has returned." He dropped to one knee, then both, pressing his forehead to the stone floor in a gesture of absolute submission and reverence. "Forgive us, first daughter. Forgive us for not seeing what you were, for not protecting you as we should have." His words seemed to break the spell that had frozen the crowd, and like a wave, pack members began to kneel. First one, then 10, then hundreds, until the entire grand hall was filled with wolves bowing before a girl who that very morning had been nobody worth noticing. Ilara stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed, terrified, and completely unsure what she was supposed to do or say. Killian remained standing, as was his right as Alpha King, but even he looked at her differently now. The calculation in his golden eyes had been replaced by something else: recognition, respect, and underneath both, something that looked dangerously close to fascination. He moved closer, closing the distance between them until he stood directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the scent of pine and night air that clung to him. "Ilara of the primordial line," he said formally, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "Fenrir has chosen you. The old magic has acknowledged you. And I, Killian Stormborn, Alpha King of the Blood Moon Pack and Sovereign of the Northern Territories, recognize your right to stand as equal to any ruler in this realm." He extended his hand once more, and this time Alara understood what he was offering. Not just assistance, but partnership, alliance, a place beside him not as a subordinate, but as someone whose bloodline was potentially even more ancient and powerful than his own. If you want to see how this story ends, make sure you are subscribed with notifications on. Alara looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment, her mind racing. Accepting would change everything, would thrust her into a world of politics and power struggles and expectations she had no training to meet. But refusing would be worse. Would be an insult not just to Killian but to the magic itself, to the ancestors who had somehow kept her bloodline alive through centuries of near extinction, to the wolf now pacing inside her consciousness and demanding she claim what was rightfully hers. She reached out and placed her hand in his. The moment their skin made contact, power arced between them, visible to everyone in the hall as silver and gold light intertwined and spiraled upward. Alara gasped at the intensity of it, at the sense of connection that suddenly existed between her and this king who until moments ago had been nothing more than a distant figure she observed from the shadows. She could feel his wolf, powerful and dominant and absolutely alpha in every way, and she could feel how her own primordial wolf responded to it. Not with submission, as she might have expected, but with challenge and interest, and a recognition that went deeper than logic or reason. Mate. The word echoed through her consciousness, though whether it came from her wolf or his, or from the magic binding them together, she could not say. But she knew, with absolute certainty, that what Fenrir had recognized was not just her bloodline. It was this connection, this bond that should not exist between a kitchen servant and a king, but apparently did anyway, because magic and fate cared nothing for social hierarchies or carefully laid plans. Killian's eyes widened slightly, and Alara knew he felt it too. The bond, the pull, the absolute certainty that somehow, impossibly, they were meant to stand together. "This changes everything," he said quietly, so only she could hear, and Alara did not know if he meant politically or personally or both. Probably both. Definitely both. He turned to address the crowd, though he did not. Release her hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "The Ceremonia da Lua de Sangue will conclude as the old magic demands. Ilara of the primordial line will stand beside me not as consort, but as equal ruler, as the ancient laws decree when one bearing the first blood is discovered. The implications of those words rippled through the hall like shockwaves. Equal ruler. Not queen in the traditional sense, subordinate to the king, but actual shared sovereignty. It was unprecedented, radical, and according to laws so old, most wolves had forgotten they existed, completely legitimate. Lady Seraphina made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. Ilara could not tell which, and then the woman turned and walked from the hall with her head high and her white dress trailing behind her like the ghost of futures that would never be. Several of her supporters followed, their faces dark with disapproval, but most of the pack remained, kneeling, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next was that Killian led Ilara to the dais, to the throne carved from black obsidian, and gestured for her to stand beside him while the High Elder completed the blood rites. The ceremony that followed was ancient and complex, involving oaths spoken in languages Ilara did not consciously know but somehow understood, involving her blood mixed with Killian's and offered to the ancestors, involving Fenrir standing guard, beside them as witness and protector. Through it all, Ilara felt as if she were moving through a dream, her mind unable to fully process the magnitude of what was occurring. Just this morning she had been invisible, worthless. Now she stood beside the most powerful wolf in the realm, while hundreds knelt before her and ancient magic sang in her veins. When the ceremony finally concluded, the first light of dawn was breaking through the high windows of the grand hall, painting everything in shades of gold and pink that seemed almost gentle after the intensity of the blood moon's red glow. Killian turned to her, and for the first time since this all began, he allowed his formal mask to slip just slightly. "You must be exhausted," he said, and there was genuine concern in his tone. "We should get you somewhere you can rest, somewhere you can process everything that has happened." Ilara wanted to laugh at the absurdity of that statement. Process? How did one process discovering they were descended from ancient royalty? How did one process developing a mate bond with an alpha king? How did one process going from servant to sovereign in the span of a single night? But before she could respond, before she could even begin to formulate words that might express the chaos in her mind, the doors to the grand hall slammed open with enough force to crack the stone frame. A messenger stumbled in, his clothes torn, his face streaked with blood, his eyes wild with panic. "Alpha King," he gasped out, barely able to stand. "The eastern border. We are under attack. An army, thousands strong, led by wolves we have never seen before. They carry banners marked with symbols from the old wars. They are asking for the primordial. They are demanding she be turned over to them, or they will destroy everything." The hall erupted in chaos once more, but this time the fear was different. This time it was immediate and real. Killian's expression hardened instantly, the brief moment of gentleness vanishing behind the mask of a king who had led his people through countless battles. He looked at Ilara, and in his golden eyes she saw both protection and a question. She had just been acknowledged as his equal. That meant whatever decision they made next, they would make it together. "They want me," Ilara said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded, despite the terror clawing at her insides. "If I go to them, if I surrender myself, will they leave the pack alone?" "No." Killian's response was immediate and absolute. "You are under my protection now, under Fenrir's protection, under the protection of every wolf who just witnessed your blood awaken. I do not surrender what is mine, and you are not going anywhere near whatever force is at our borders." His possessiveness should have bothered her, should have felt like just another cage, but instead it settled something inside her that had been vibrating with fear. She was not alone in this. Whatever happened next, she would not face it as the invisible kitchen girl who had no one and nothing. She would face it as what she apparently was, a primordial, a ruler. A woman with power she was only beginning to understand. Then we go to them together, Alara said, and watched Killian's expression shift from protective anger to something that looked almost like pride. We find out who they are and what they want, and we show them that the primordial line does not bow to threats. Fenrir, who had been silent throughout the ceremony, chose that moment to release a roar that shook the very foundations of the palace. The ancient war beast's eyes glowed brighter, and Alara felt her own wolf respond, felt power rising inside her that was both terrifying and exhilarating. Whatever was waiting for them at the eastern border, whatever ancient enemies had emerged from history to threaten her pack, they would learn very quickly that awakening a primordial was not the same as defeating one. Killian smiled, and it was the smile of a king who had just realized he had gained not just a mate, but an ally, who might actually be strong enough to stand beside him in the battles to come. "Then we ride at dawn," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Prepare for war." The crowd began to move, wolves rushing to gather weapons and armor, messengers running to alert the pack's warriors, the organized chaos of an army mobilizing for battle. Through it all, Alara stood beside the Alpha King with Fenrir at her side, and magic crackling along her skin, and for the first time in her 20 years of life, she did not feel invisible. She felt seen. She felt powerful. She felt like she might actually deserve the destiny that had just crashed into her life and changed everything. The battle that followed would be spoken of for generations. The army at the eastern border turned out to be remnants of the old families, wolves who had served the primordial line before it fell, and who had been waiting centuries for a true heir to emerge. They had not come to destroy but to kneel, to offer their service, to pledge their loyalty to the bloodline they had never stopped believing would return. But their arrival had triggered responses from other factions, from packs who feared what a resurgent primordial line might mean for the current power structures, from political rivals who saw opportunity in chaos, from ancient enemies who remembered when the first wolves had ruled with absolute authority and wanted to ensure that could never happen again. The fighting lasted 3 days. 3 days of blood and battle and magic unleashed in ways that had not been seen since the wars that reshaped the realm. Alara fought beside Killian, her primordial wolf emerging for the first time, and proving to be every bit as powerful as the legend suggested. She moved through the battlefield like moonlight made flesh, her silver fur glowing even in daylight, her power washing over enemies and allies alike. Fenrir fought with her, the ancient war beast obeying her commands as readily as it obeyed Killian's, and together they became a force that could not be stopped. Pack members who had ignored her for 20 years watched in awe as the kitchen girl they had dismissed proved herself to be a warrior queen in every sense of the word. When the dust finally settled, when treaties had been signed and alliances forged, and the last of the hostile forces either defeated or integrated into the Blood Moon Pack, Alara stood once more in the grand hall beside Killian. This time, though, there was no ceremony, no crowd, just the two of them, and the dawn light streaming through windows that had been shattered during the fighting and hastily repaired. "You saved us," Killian said quietly. "Your power, your presence, it turned the tide. Without you, we would have been overwhelmed." Alara shook her head. "We saved each other. That is what mates do, is it not?" The word hung between them, finally acknowledged, and Killian reached out to cup her face in his hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses from years of wielding weapons. "I did not choose you," he admitted. "Fenrir did. Fate did. But given the chance to choose again, knowing everything I know now, I would choose you every single time." Alara felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, though whether from exhaustion or emotion or relief that she had survived, she could not say. "I spent 20 years being invisible," she whispered, "being nothing. And now I am everything I never knew I could be. It is terrifying." "I know," Killian said, and the understanding in his voice made her believe he truly did. "But you do not have to carry it alone. That is what this bond means. That is what being equals means. We face it together. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but Alara did not want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the life that had been offered to her, impossible as it seemed. When their lips finally met, the kiss was soft and careful, a promise rather than a demand, and when they pulled apart, Alara saw her own wonder reflected in his golden eyes. Together, she agreed, and felt her primordial wolf settle contentedly inside her consciousness, finally at peace with where it belonged, with who it belonged to. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of political maneuvering, of learning to navigate court politics, of discovering the full extent of her powers and what it meant to be a primordial in a world that had forgotten her kind existed. Alara made mistakes. She struggled. There were moments when she wanted nothing more than to return to the simple invisibility of scrubbing floors and being ignored. But Killian was there, patient and supportive, and occasionally frustrated, but never dismissive, never cruel. And slowly, carefully, Alara began to grow into the role that had been thrust upon her. She appointed advisors from among the wolves who had once ignored her, choosing those who had shown kindness when they did not have to, and she began to implement changes that would ensure no one else in the pack would ever feel as worthless as she once had. Lady Seraphina eventually returned to court, her pride wounded but her political instincts too sharp to stay away from power permanently. She and Alara would never be friends, but they developed a careful professional respect, and Seraphina proved to be invaluable when it came to navigating the more treacherous aspects of court politics. The High Elder became one of Alara's most trusted advisors, teaching her the old histories, the ancient magics, everything she needed to know about the primordial line and what her ancestors had been capable of achieving. And Fenrir remained at her side always, the ancient war beast becoming as much her protector as Killian's, a living symbol of the bond between old magic and new authority. 6 months after the blood moon ceremony, Alara stood once more in the grand hall, but this time she wore a crown. Not the one Killian wore, which had been passed down through generations of Alpha Kings, but a new one, forged specifically for her from silver mined from the sacred mountains, and set with moonstones that glowed with their own internal light. The coronation was smaller than the blood moon ceremony had been, more intimate, attended only by pack members who had proven their loyalty and allies who had earned their trust. As the High Elder placed the crown on her head and declared her queen in truth, and not just in title, Alara looked out at the faces watching her and marveled at how much had changed. How much she had changed. Killian stood beside her, his own crown gleaming in the torchlight. And when the ceremony concluded and the pack erupted in celebration, he took her hand and led her from the hall to the balcony that overlooked the entire territory. From here, Alara could see the forests where she had once been forbidden to roam, the training grounds where warriors honed their skills, the homes of pack members who now looked to her for guidance and protection. "Do you regret it?" Killian asked softly. "The life you lost? The simplicity?" Alara considered the question seriously, thinking about the girl she had been just 6 months ago, invisible and ignored, and so certain she would never be anything more. Then she thought about the woman she was now, powerful and seen and standing beside a king who looked at her as if she were the moon itself. "No," she said finally. "I do not regret it. That girl needed to die so this woman could live." Killian smiled and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her as the celebration continued inside without them. "Then we build something new," he murmured against her hair. "Something that honors both the old ways and the new. Something worthy of a primordial queen and the Alpha King who was lucky enough to be chosen by her." Alara laughed, the sound bright and genuine and so different from the quiet, frightened silence she had maintained for 20 years. "Chosen by Fenrir, you mean?" "Chosen by fate," Killian corrected. The war beast just had the good sense to recognize it first. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who loves epic romance. Tell me in the comments, did you see this ending coming? As stars began to appear in the darkening sky above them, Ilara leaned into Killian's embrace and allowed herself to simply exist in the moment. No longer invisible, no longer worthless, no longer the girl who scrubbed floors and kept her head down and survived by being nothing. She was Ilara of the primordial line, queen of the Blood Moon Pack, mate to the Alpha King. And for the first time in her entire life, she was exactly where she was meant to be.